Welcome to today's webinar, Shoring Up Linking Social Protection and Early Warning Systems for the Fisheries Sector. This webinar will be under the umbrella of FAO's course on addressing the climate change and poverty nexus, and will seek to highlight social protection as a mechanism to mitigate the climate change and poverty nexus. Through today's event, we will explore how social security can enhance anticipatory action to prepare and respond to covariate shocks by linking social protection with early warning systems. My name is Daniela Salazar Herrera. I'm a fishery officer with the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO, and I will be your host through today's session. Now, to start us off, it's my pleasure to introduce Angélica Jacome Daza, the Director of the FAO Office for Small Island Developing States, Least Developed Countries, and Landlocked Developing Countries, who will provide some introductory remarks.
Thank you, Daniela. It is my pleasure to join all of you today for this important discussion. Globally, we're increasingly aware of the negative impacts of climate change, including how it's expected to worsen poverty and disproportionately impact already vulnerable groups and those facing inequality, particularly women and indigenous peoples. Small-scale fisheries based in coastal communities around the world are facing unprecedented increases in the frequency and severity of acute climate shocks, such as hurricanes. In the Caribbean right now, there's a tropical storm Brett, as we've all observed, as well as ever increased sub-acute shocks and slower onset stressors. This is closely linked with social dimensions and dynamics, and agriculture and coastal dependent livelihoods in small island developing states, or SIDS, tend to be disproportionately affected by climate change due to a combination of factors such as high exposure to hazards, socio-economic marginalization, vulnerability, inadequate infrastructure, lack of access to services such as healthcare and social protection. Repeated and continued exposures to shocks and stressors erodes assets used for recovery in a cycle of worsening existing vulnerabilities and creating new poverty. Many communities, organizations, and countries are struggling to adapt as this climate poverty nexus challenges efforts to build resilience. Urgent action is needed. Without effective policies and practical actions that work together, the livelihoods of millions of small-scale fishers are at risk, along with the food security of millions of people who rely on fish as a primary source of protein. Being on the front lines of climate change also means that SIDS are important allies in the fight against it. Indeed, the majority of SIDS recognize the need for strengthened climate change adaptation in agricultural sectors, as expressed in their nationally determined contributions, known as NDCs. SIDS are also on the forefront of initiatives to better define the global goal for adaptation, the GGGA. FAO recognizes the need to support capacity building and technology that is appropriate to scale and unique conditions for different SIDS, as well as the need to support a better recognition of and support for loss and damage experienced by SIDS, as well as a more just transition, including to address the significant global deficit in adaptation finance to small island developing states and other developing countries, including least developed countries and landlocked developing countries. FAO is committed to achieving better production, better nutrition, better environment, and a better life towards equitable blue transformation. Social protection is an important mechanism to achieve this goal. Evidence shows that for the fisheries sector, social protection can increase households' adaptive capacity, thus avoiding long-term household disadvantages and ensuring decent working conditions. FAO is committed to promoting a systems approach to social protection, to avoid fragmentation of interventions, together with partners, build and strengthen nationally owned social protection systems that are well integrated in a broader livelihood promotion, fisheries management, and equitable blue transformation. Hence, the importance of achieving coherence between social protection policies and sustainable fisheries management. In today's session, you will learn about FAO's current work on social protection in fisheries, including some results from recent work in 3 SIDS regions to characterize the existing social protection for fisheries, identifying the gaps and opportunities for improving coverage and linkages with early warning systems. With that, I thank you very much, and I wish you all a very successful session today. Thank you.
Thank you, Angelica. Today's session includes three main components. First, I will give a brief overview of the social protection agenda in the fisheries sector. Then we will hear from three research associates from the International Collective in Support of Fish Workers, Ian Horsford, Menka Vasan, and Vijay Naidu, who will delve into the trends and gaps of social protection for the fisheries sector, respectively. Patrick McConney, Senior Lecturer at the University of West Indies, will deliver some reflections and concluding remarks. Thank you, panelists, for joining us today. Please visit the chat to share your comments, and we will also be sharing some links to the course and publications on social protection. And please note that if you wish to post a question, you can do so through the YouTube live stream of the webinar, and we will try to answer them at the end of the event. Now, to help us contextualize today's topic, let us start by delving into social protection. Social protection is a set of policies and programs to protect all people against poverty, vulnerability, and social exclusion. It works through three key pillars: social assistance, social security, and labor market interventions. Social assistance are non-contributory programs such as cash or in-kind transfers, including food baskets, school meals, or utility subsidies. Social security programs are contributory programs such as health insurance. Labor market interventions include policies and programs to facilitate workers' integration into the labor market and ensure decent working conditions. These interventions include activation measures such as training and market access, as well as labor regulatory adjustments and enforcement measures such as minimum wage standards. Social protection, inclusive of its three pillars, has four main functions: to protect, prevent, promote, and transform. The protective function seeks to provide means such as through productive input transfers and to mitigate the impacts of shocks. The preventative function of social protection aims to strengthen resilience and prevent the loss of income and assets. The promotive function strives to generate employment, develop capabilities, and establish autogenous mechanisms such as revolving funds. Finally, the transformative function of social protection has an objective to transform beneficiaries' economic capacity, enable productive inclusion, and enhance greater gender equality within households. The fisheries sector plays a key role in incentivizing, the fisheries sector plays a key role in incentivizing local economies and achieving food security for households. However, it's people and households who are involved in fisheries at all points along the value chain face multiple challenges that call for comprehensive social protection that reaches and incorporates the needs of the sector. The fisheries sector is diverse, as are the challenges it faces. Overall, natural resource-based livelihoods such as fish worldwide, especially in tropical ecosystems and small island developing states. Fishers have already been feeling the impacts of climate change for coming decades. Both covariate shocks, which are large-scale events directly impacting large numbers of people in a geographical area, such as, for example, hurricanes, and sub-acute stressors, which are smaller events such as seasonal flooding, are increasing in frequency and intensity. At the same time, slow-onset changes like ocean acidification continue to progress. In many cases, fisheries' vulnerabilities to the impacts of these is compounded by poverty and their marginalization experience, gender inequality, migrant status, income variability of the sector value chain, highly vulnerable to covariate shocks as they render in low adaptive capacity. Low adaptive capacity can result in negative coping strategies to protect short-term well-being and consumption, which can generate a long detriment for households. The evidence available shows that social protection in the fishery sector can increase household adaptive capacity and thus avoiding a long-term disadvantage for households and ensuring decent working conditions. The following slides will now delve into how social protection can be a mechanism to increase household adaptive capacity to economic, social, and climate shocks. Social protection is a key mechanism for sustainable fisheries management and decent working conditions. Small-scale fisheries are resource availability, seasonality, or management measures such as closed seasons, which prevent them from fishing. Social protection mechanisms, such as unemployment benefits, can compensate for a fishery management strategy affecting fishers' livelihoods. For example, in the case of closed seasons, unemployment benefits can act as an ex-ante preventative tool to reduce the risk of overfishing and enhance compliance with management strategies. The latter support and sustainability and enhance the sustainability stock and protects future employment. Unfortunately, these programs are rarely available in the fisheries sector. Social protection is also key to advancing decent working conditions. Social security interventions can ensure that fishers are covered in case of employment injuries, unemployment, and loss and theft of equipment, which protects and promotes their livelihood standards. Social protection establishes minimum standards such as minimum wage, labor rights, and mechanisms. Similarly, it can also incentivize formalization and support interventions to increase value added. Social protection is a key mechanism for responding to covariate and idiosyncratic shocks. Social assistance interventions can provide short-term support when a shock hits. In this scenario, unconditional cash transfers and cash for work or food for work commonly used instruments for post-disaster support. Cash for work programs usually essential works such as clearing debris. Similarly, social security interventions create a safety net and contingency plan if a covariate shock hits. This increases fishers' adaptive capacity to respond to short-term shocks. For example, formal insurance mechanisms can protect assets affected by covariate shocks and fishers' income disasters. Insurance programs increase fishers' adaptive capacity by providing a safety net and deterring engagement in negative coping strategies. Alternatively, informal insurance mechanisms are also key to supporting fishers in responding to shocks. In exchange for a membership fee, organizations such as mutual societies can provide insurance for members, their families, and their property against injury and damage due to natural hazards or other events. Social networks can also support intermittent lending on a non-profit basis to finance day-to-day needs such as paying bills and school fees. These mechanisms work better in responding to idiosyncratic shocks. It might need support which is derived from limited funds. The Social Protection for Fisheries Database, or Software for Fish in short, is a new initiative that we are working on with support from the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation. It compiles all social protection programs and analyzes them in different categories. This database seeks to become an inventive to the fishery sector, meaning those programs that target and reach the fishery sector. Currently, the sector is extremely data at the global, regional, and national level, and based on it, work at the government level to build policy and program gaps and that they might be aware of. The software for fish for more evidence needs to be collected. For example, in the case of programs that show low reach levels to the sector, what sections of the fishery sector might be marginalized and in need of further social protection, and where improvements can be made. Overall, it allows countries to expand, assess, and improve their social protection system towards the fishery sector. For example, it can highlight several programs targeting the same population and identify a gap in the interoperability of their registries and benefits. The Software for Fish database has two main areas of information: the country at glance section and inventory of social protection programs. The country at glance section holds information at the national level to provide context. This area collects data of the social protection framework, the enabling environment for greater coherence, and economic, demographic, labor market, and social indicators. The inventory of social protection schemes collects information at the program level. It holds data on the basic program information, targeting, beneficiaries, and coverage, as well as eligibility criteria, graduation, information systems, and delivery mechanism expenditure. Climate change and shock responsiveness and coherence in 3 African, Caribbean, and Pacific Seas regions, but it will be applied to other countries as well. Mapping the social protection programs accessible for for fishers allow us to understand where synergies could also be made with early warning systems to deploy anticipatory action. Early warning systems are referred to integrated systems of hazard monitoring, forecasting, and prediction activities, both communities, governments, businesses, and other stakeholders to take timely action to reduce disasters before hazardous events. Anticipatory action is the sphere of action within risk management that mitigates the impacts of disasters and shocks on livelihoods and food security. Its distinctive element is that it plans actions to be taken before disasters occurs and before they reach their peak to avoid some or all of their impact. The anticipatory action approach can reduce the damage and losses in disasters and crises. This chart shows how early warning systems can be linked to social protection systems to deploy anticipatory action when natural hazards and man-made threats hit or reach a specific threshold. So when a natural hazard or a man-made threat hits or reaches a specific threshold, an early warning system is deployed. This alert or warning information on the disaster, its predictability, its onset and recurrence, it opens a temporary window of time to implement an anticipatory action. An anticipatory action to protect fishers, which mitigates the crisis adverse effect and reduces the depth and breadth of the impacts regarding destitution, deprivation, and poverty. Linkages with early warning systems can be made with formal early warning systems or informal ones based on accessibility to different technologies and resources. Linking early warning systems with social protection to deploy anticipatory action allows to ex ante build the resilience of households and prepare them better for when shocks hit. By next year, so keep an eye out for the website. Thank you, and now we will hear the highlights from these regional studies. To start off, I will pass it on to Ian, who will delve into the Caribbean Seas case. Please, I will pass it on to you now to present the Caribbean case.
Hi, everyone. I think we're having a
Good day.
bit of a... Oh, it's working. Okay, on to you, Ian. Go ahead.
Yes, there was an issue in terms of sharing the screen.
It's working now. Please go ahead.
Yes, My task today basically is to highlight the main findings of the studies done with respect to the social protection system, as well as the early warning system. In terms of the Caribbean, the studies was done in 16 Caribbean territories, and it looked at the social protection program. What are the major trends and gaps? Across the board, for instance, economies of scale tend to impact the approach taken with respect to social protection, as well to a less extent in terms of the early warning system. In the context of the smaller Caribbean SIDS, for instance, there tend to be a focus on contributory type programs such as social insurance and health insurance due to the issues of economies of scale. The larger, more populous Caribbean territories such as Cuba, Haiti, Dominican Republic, there was a strong emphasis more so on social assistance program, labor market interventions such as entrepreneurship, job programs, vocational training. In terms of regional gaps and threats, overall, there was a limited synergies between fisheries and social protection policies, as well as there was limited interoperability between the registries of fishers, social protection, and disaster. There was also an issue in terms of barriers with respect to access to the programs. A lot of this was related to, for instance, mistrust of government institutions, fishers being misinformed or uninformed about the various benefits, and more recently with COVID, the issue of the digital divide. These issues particularly were paramount when we look at from the standpoint, out of 10 of the 16 Caribbean SIDS, 30, they were ranked in the top 30 based on the Global Climate Risk Index. With respect to opportunities, a few countries, for instance, Antigua and Barbuda and Dominica, there was a prerequisite for fishers actually registering the social protection program before they actually register as a fisher. This is one way in which you can actually synergize the policies between fisheries and social protection program. Another area where we have to address is the issue of evolving the beneficiary registries in the case of social insurance to social registries, as well as have them linked to the various fisheries and disaster registries. In the area of ensuring that no one is left behind, they also need to better utilization of the regional framework and existing mechanisms, particularly in the area, say, for instance, the area of social issue of insurance, microinsurance for fishers, as well as sovereign insurance to actually ensure government facilities pertaining to fisheries. There's also the regional initiative, mainstreaming gender in fisheries through the Caribbean Regional Fisheries Mechanism. Number of CARICOM countries, they have a common fisheries policy with a number of protocols that ensure there's synergy going forward. In terms of the various programs that were actually social protection benefits that were available across the Caribbean, it was varied from, for instance, in the case of Haiti, as low as 5.8% of the population had access to at least one social protection program, to as high as 100% in the case of Guyana. On average, roughly half of the population have at least one access, benefit from at least one social protection benefit. With respect to the early warning system, there are two main approaches. A community-based approach, which was mainly stakeholder-driven, and there tend to be a focus on traditional knowledge and use of indigenous knowledge in the larger territories, while in the smaller states, you have a basic governance focused on at the national level, where technology is actually used to basically pass on the alerts and warnings to fisher folks and the general population. Two applications that that were pretty much utilized within the region was the Common Alert Protocol. This was adopted by the International Telecommunication Union as well as the World Meteorological Organization. Across the board, major challenges that countries face was inadequate legislation, the ability to actually sustain these early warning systems, as well as the issue of false alert, fake news, and the digital divide when it comes to the fisheries sector. One way we can address that is through the Common Alert Protocol, which allow the use of multiple platforms to get across the message. This could be television, radio, sirens, automated sirens, as well as other means of communication, VHF. For us now to actually move forward and actually link early warning system with social protection, there has to be some linkages taking place between the social protection program as well as the early warning system. For example, in the case of the social protection program, sorry, let me just go back. In the case of the social protection program, you can basically adapt the social registry based on the people that are vulnerable to the various shocks, based on the information provided by the early warning system. On the other hand, you can also have in place use the social protection registry to deploy anticipatory action in the case of when you have an early warning. It allows you to quickly identify the population that is vulnerable, and then you can actually roll out, whether it be a cash advance or in-kind approach, you will be able to actually employ these measures prior to having a major storm or flood. One thing that has to be present is in the early warning system is a predefined trigger. This could be inches of rainfall based on the speed of wind or any other factor. By doing that, you can actually reduce damages and loss, as well as lessen the impact on food security and livelihood. This overall would strengthen the overall resilience of the system, as well as reduce humanitarian costs. For all this to happen, there have to be certain predefined conditions. One, the social registry has to be integrated, and there has to be an interoperability framework between the various registries so you can share the information as well as deal with outreach, intake, registration, and look at eligibility function, as well as rollout in the case of, say, for instance, cash advance. The social registry, again, it has to be scaled at the national level. In a lot of the islands, it's not scaled out across the wider population. So for instance, when we had the issue with COVID, there are certain groups that were not already included in the social registry. So that has to be scaled up and the proper framework put in place to actually deal with shocks. The system also has to be based on a robust multi-hazard early warning system. If that is not in place and there's necessary financial support to actually support the system, then you will have a problem scaling up from our current level of preparation to deal with shocks to in the event that you have an exogenous shocks taking place. So sustainable finance is one of the key areas that most countries were lacking. Some have moved ahead in terms of providing various disaster funds to address this issue. All this has to be based and guided by various social principles, for instance, social inclusion, the issue of individuals with disability, individuals that are, for instance, the issue of gender equality, as well as sustainability. And there needs to be a coordinated mechanism across the board to deal with interagency works. In some islands, you would have in place a social council to address this. I will stop here given my short time and hopefully I can answer some questions in the future.
Thank you very much, Ian, and thanks everyone. We're trying to now resolve some issues around the connectivity, so we really do thank you for your patience with any connectivity issues that there may have been. But thank you very much, Ian. Pass it on to Menka, who will delve into the African seeds case. Go ahead, Menka.
Great, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I will be presenting on the African SIDS. There are 6 African SIDS, 3 of which are in the Indian Ocean, including Mauritius, Seychelles, and Comoros, and 3 in the Atlantic Ocean, which include Sao Tome and Principe, Cabo Verde, and Guinea-Bissau. The fisheries sector is critical to all of the SIDS, particularly for export in the higher income SIDS, such as Mauritius and Seychelles, but is an essential livelihood and critical for food security and nutrition across all the SIDS. So for the methodology for this research, desk research was entailed. Also, a survey was sent to key informants, and a brief follow-up interview were used to find relevant legislation, policy, and laws on social protection for the fisheries sector, and to better understand the social protection schemes and any potential issues or gaps in coverage. After the databases for both social protection and early warning systems were completed, a data validation workshop was held with the key informants and other stakeholders to fill in any gaps and verify the information that was gathered. The workshop ended with a region-wide discussion on articulating early warning systems with social protection and how to foster future collaboration between the SIDS. In the regional analysis, we found that all 6 SIDS experienced similar climate change issues, particularly sea level rise. The early warning systems database analysis indicated that some of the SIDS were already collaborating on regional cooperation for multiple hazards such as cyclones, storm surges, and flooding. All of the SIDS face the challenge of combating overexploitation of ocean resources and declining fish stocks, particularly from the presence of foreign vessels. A key finding in our research was the notable differences in social protection policies between the higher income SIDS, Seychelles and Mauritius, and the lower income SIDS, which are Comoros, Sao Tome and Principe, Guinea-Bissau, and Cabo Verde. The 4 smaller SIDS had no social protection schemes that were targeted to the fisheries sector. Mauritius had the most targeted schemes, which totaled 4 schemes, but keep in mind many of the policies have these sub-schemes, so there were multiple types of social protection under a single policy. Seychelles used to have 2 fisheries targeted schemes, but switched to universal. Comoros had 5 universal schemes, Sao Tome and Principe had 3, Guinea-Bissau it's 4, and Cabo Verde 5. In smaller, lower income African SIDS in particular, the lack of accurate data is a severe constraint to the expansion of social protection. Investment into the collection of accurate socioeconomic, demographic, and categorical data that is relevant to articulating social protection with the fisheries sector must be central to any social protection investment. This also implies that coherence and communication between social protection and fisheries departments must be strengthened. This research determined that producing an up-to-date, accurate social registry is critical to establishing any social protection intervention, and maintaining the social registry is key to its continuity. Countries like Mauritius, Seychelles, and Cabo Verde that have the financial and human resources to employ officials who physically go out into communities to collect on-the-ground data are more successful than those who rely on census data or other proxies. It was also found that the role of international assistance and external agencies is central to the support of the social protection schemes of lower income countries, specifically Cabo Verde, Sao Tome, Principe, Comoros, and Guinea-Bissau. A significant gap that was found in this research was the need to include gender-specific social protection coverage and benefits. Women play a vital role in the fisheries sector, particularly the artisanal and aquaculture sector in Africa throughout the value chain. Social assistance and gender-specific benefits in the fisheries sector are lagging behind. In Mauritius, many women are gleaners, but the government does not include this part of the fisheries value chain under registration for an artisanal fishing license, which is required to receive fisheries targeted social protection benefits. In Mauritius, only 35 out of 2,200 registered artisanal fishers are women. Hundreds are left out of the registration process due to lack of proof of catch, and many of them glean. In order to qualify for benefits under the Fishermen Welfare Act or Fund, a beneficiary must have an artisanal fishing license. Therefore, the social protection schemes Mauritius has in place have this gender bias, as they're mostly benefiting men, even though there are women who participate in the fisheries value chain. Contrastingly, Seychelles switched its fisheries targeted social protection policy to universal scheme, so even unregistered fishers can access it. Women are often excluded from social protection policies due to the social roles of the fisheries sector. The environmental shocks fisheries experience, such as climate change, biodiversity loss, depletion of fish, and natural disasters, is not gender neutral, which is why it's pertinent for social protection policies to incorporate gender targeted schemes. And then lastly, Mauritius has a bad weather allowance in which registered artisanal fishers are compensated on bad weather days when they are unable to go out to sea. There is a direct line of communication between the Mauritius Meteorological Services and the Ministry of Blue Economy, in which Meteorological Services issues a sea state report to the ministry via email twice a day. The ministry then enables the payment of the bad weather allowance to the fishers, and the payment arrives within 3 days. There are multiple communication methods for the weather reporting to be made available to the fishers, including mobile phone, email, a special fishers bulletin issued at 4 a.m., radio, regional officers who can advise if it is safe to go out to sea, as well as a regular bulletin and a fisheries targeted bulletin that is issued 3 times per day. This is an example of a cash transfer to help alleviate financial stress caused by weather-related events, as well as protecting the lives of fishers so they do not risk going out to sea when it's dangerous to do so. Mauritius requires further training and education of fishers on the impacts of climate change and safety at sea in order to obtain an artisanal fishing license. This example is a stark contrast to the smaller, lower income SIDS. In Comoros, it was found that while the country does not yet have statistical data for last year, 2022, the frequency of accidents at sea is sadly increasing. The Coast Guard and Security Department are to guarantee civilians security at sea, which includes fishers. Sometimes they're able to intervene when a fisher is lost at sea, but this is not a guarantee due to lack of capacity. The Coast Guard sometimes does not even have basic means to perform a rescue mission, such as no access to boats, fuel, or a captain. This exemplifies the differences in social protection and safety at sea between the higher income SIDS and the lower income SIDS. So unfortunately, that's all the time I have today, but I hope that even though this is just a brief snapshot of the findings we uncovered in this research on the African SIDS, I hope that those who are on this webinar found this information useful. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Menka, for walking us through the experience of the African SIDS with social protection. I just wanted to let everyone know in the event that I will be continuing only with audio just to improve connectivity and avoid anything or us losing connectivity. And now with that, let me pass on to Vijay, who will delve a bit into the Pacific. Thank you very much.
Bulavinaka, good morning to everyone and to my fellow presenters. The methodology that we followed was very much similar to Menka has described, as well as Ian. The research that we undertook for FAO and the International Collective Support of Fish Workers was jointly done by Professor Joely Veteaki and myself. The social protection programs in the 15 countries that we looked at vary very considerably, with formal social protection in the larger islands of Papua New Guinea, the Solomons, and Vanuatu, largely absent. In these larger countries, there is a heavy reliance on kinship networks and what is referred to as one talk or one language systems, whereby remittances and goods in kind are provided for the wider family and those who are vulnerable within the wider kinship networks. formal social protection programs are most extensive, which has strong links with New Zealand. But there are less extensive programs available in most of the other 15 island countries. And we have provided a tabulation of the information. And for those who are interested, they can contact FAO and get the table information about details regarding the programs. Contributory social insurance schemes is most widespread, and whereby usually formal sector workers contribute to pension funds and benefit from these, as well as health insurance schemes. In terms of social assistance, there are programs that are universal or general in nature for the elderly, the disabled, children, and mothers. But there is no specific programs anywhere in the Pacific Islands for the fisheries sector. And I look in envy at Mauritius, which has got specific targeted programs for those who make their living from fishing. The early warning systems in the Pacific are very well developed, and these are linked to extreme weather events, earthquake, tsunami, and volcanic eruptions. Early warning systems for cyclones are particularly well developed, both at the regional level as well as in each of the 15 countries. Early warning communications is reliant on technology, largely radio, and where available TV and increasingly mobile phones. But in the Pacific Island countries, unfortunately, there is no linking of social protection with early warning systems. Instead, there is heavy reliance on humanitarian relief and rehabilitation, as well as the support of donor countries, especially Australia and New Zealand. Currently, there is no registry for fish workers, artisan and subsistence fishers. And while there is these universal programs for people in some countries below the poverty line, it is not necessarily available to everybody, and especially those who are in the informal sector. In the larger countries, of course, about a good 70 to 80% of the population work within the informal sector. So they are excluded from programs that are designed to support those who are actually working in the formal sector. So there's a lot of work to be done in terms of getting the wider population access to social protection. And given the impacts of COVID and the heavy indebtedness of a number of Pacific Island countries, the physical space for programs for social protection is really constrained. But having said that, I want to refer to Timor-Leste, which has, right from the outset, actually put into its constitution the importance of social protection for all its people. And so I think political will is very important. And I think with the work that FAO is doing, greater attention will be directed towards fisheries sector. Already, with the support of the United Nations program, there is a parametric micro-insurance scheme that has started in Fiji with $2 Fijian a week payment for a insurance coverage of 1,000 to help people very quickly respond to the harm caused by extreme weather events. But this is being piloted in Fiji. It is not clear the uptake on it and when it will be then spread over to the other gaps. And I have not referred to the gender dimensions at all, but as elsewhere in the small island states, there are issues of gender bias that need to be attended to. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vijay, for such an interesting presentation, and thank you all of you for this very interesting presentations. I'm really looking forward to reading more on the 3 African seeds. Now, please let me pass it on to Patrick for some key reflections, some connections and linkages with addressing the climate change and the poverty nexus. On to you, Patrick. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone, and thanks to FAO for giving me the opportunity to participate in this important webinar. As you would have heard earlier, according to the weather folks, Tropical Storm Brett is just passing north of us. And I'm not going to attempt connectivity, so mine is going to be a short story. But the passage of Brett also brings to mind very much the relevance of this particular webinar. As I live on the coast, about 1 kilometer from a fishing village, I can look out my window, and this morning I saw at 5 o'clock that all of the fishing vessels had left the open mooring. So clearly early warning, both formal and informal, is working. But these folks are parts of households. Many of the vessels are not insured. Many of the households will rely entirely on fisheries, so they are vulnerable. And it was good to see the swiftness of their response, but it was also important to reflect on that vulnerability and the ways in which we can address it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the rich findings of the case studies shared and the framing that Daniela provided at the beginning mean to me, and I hope many of you may have reached similar conclusions from the webinar. Well, one of the observations is clearly that SIDS can't build resilience into their small-scale fisheries sectors without attention to both social protection and early warning, as I explained by that small example with colleagues in Barbados now. It's really necessary for human well-being. It's not an option, it's not necessarily a choice, it's a necessity. It may be obvious to some, but folks in other sectors may not see it that way. And we need to remember that small-scale fisheries, or fisheries in general, are an intersectoral undertaking when you look at the entire supply chain. We've also seen colleagues explain the diversity in social protection and early warning, both between and within their SIDS regions. To me, this provides an opportunity for learning, but we've also heard of the urgent attention that needs to be paid to reduce or eliminate inequalities. That is, those inequalities brought on by differences in national income, due to gender, and so forth and so on. I think that is really important. And we can also trade lessons learned in that respect. We also heard about the variation in social protection and early warning from very basic and informal systems to highly sophisticated and technical. So it is clear that one size does not fit all. And it's good to remember that when we are encountering or even designing ourselves interventions to make sure that they really are fit for purpose and fit for social system and fit for culture, and the many other parameters that are involved in design. And the cases brought that out very forcefully. We must also bear in mind that even though we talk most often, sometimes loosely, of climate change and trends, it is really the increasing variability and the uncertainty that fisher folk face all along the value chain, and the maladaptive human-induced threats, whether that is gray infrastructure, whether that is from other industries or whatever, these are worsening. So fisher folk essentially are ambushed by a lot of factors, and really in SIDS, we need to act now, as the climate change folks will tell us. The other point, which is clear, is that the climate poverty nexus in SIDS fisheries and coastal communities and socio-economic activities generally really require attention. And there are initiatives that are in progress that we can draw upon in this respect. And that is really important to bear in mind. We don't have to start from scratch. So having reflected a little bit, what then are we able to do? And just let me see if my slides are cooperating now. Of course they're not. Let me see again. Good. So the connection and the linkages for action. This is where the rubber hits the road or the propeller hits the sea. And we can see that we really need to examine the full range of social protection approaches and tools to find the best fit. I think with the projects such as the one bringing this webinar to you, that there are a lot of options on which there is now more information that we can choose from. And through collaboration, we can improve on the fit that I talked about earlier in reflections. And this includes policy entrepreneurship. What that is really is looking not only at innovation in technology, whether we're using smartphones or instruments at sea to make fisheries safer, but also the people-centered social protection that's so important. It's also important to align early warning systems with the risks that are perceived and experienced, and tailor early warning to the real uses, not just the available technology. And this is really important in terms of how people act. Their practices are very much based on perceptions, and we need to bear this in mind. I think that the database that is being built and is growing, and we really want to see that expand a lot more, covers many of the metrics and the schemes of interest and provides the basis for networking for collaboration. And that is really important. You don't want and you can't collaborate in a vacuum. You really need the data and information with which to do so effectively. We also need to appreciate the multi-level nature of social protection and advocate for schemes that can be easily scaled up and down. The parametric insurance, for example, that mentioned for the Pacific, also in the Caribbean, can be offered at a household or enterprise level up to the national level. And we really want to see a lot more of that in terms of the quick response and comprehensive nature of the protection that can be offered. Finally, but not the least, is the self-paced course, which I know that some of you are interested in, Climate Change and Poverty Nexus. I have a special interest in this because along with colleagues, we had to co-develop some of the content, and we really think that more participants in this course could provide a critical mass for change that we are seeking. So I'm going to leave you here at this point with those reflections, and to remember what this webinar was really all about. It's a lot on sharing knowledge, mobilizing knowledge for improvements, real improvements, climate responses and poverty responses in the fisheries sector. And you know where to find more information online. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for that wrap up. And I think you are completely right. This webinar today has really been about mobilizing knowledge and connecting information across the globe. And I really want to thank you, not only for wrapping up today's session and for bringing on those key conclusions. I think you're absolutely right when you say that these lessons that have been presented in 3 African, Pacific, and Caribbean regions are something to be learned from. I think we can definitely extract key lessons from them, keeping in mind that every context is different and that there is no cookie cutter approach, that there's no one size fits all policy or program, and that it's very important to see what the conditions of the sector are in each country and each region, what the resources are available, and what are the programmatic policy and legal frameworks in place to really be able to harness and expand adequate social protection to the fishery sector in a way that is also linked up with early warning systems to deploy anticipatory action, and at the end of the day, support the livelihoods of fishers along the value chain. So really thank you, Patrick, and thank you to all of our panelists today for this very informative session and for sharing the status of social protection and the coverage of social protection towards the fishery sector throughout reflect and how to link the as well with social protection programs to deploy anticipatory action. As mentioned also throughout the webinar, I would like to invite you to keep an eye out for the database profiles and the regional reports that will be coming up. And we're hoping this will be available in our website when they do come out. But also, please do take the chance to look at the Social Protection for Fisheries and Aquaculture website hosted by FAO, where you will be able to find more resources and more updates on our work as well. So just to say thank you to everyone and thanks for joining us today. And I think with that we can wrap up today's session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.